John Brown's raid that took place at Harpers Ferry in October of 1859 was a pivotal moment that led up to the Civil War. John Brown, who was an abolitionist, led a small group of men to Harpers Ferry to raid the federal arsenal that was there. His goal was to seize the weapons there and incite a slave rebellion across the South. Let's discuss a timeline of the events that happened leading up to the raid at Harpers Ferry, what happened at Harpers Ferry, and how it ended. Did John Brown accomplish his goal? Let's talk about it. So in the summer of 1858, John Brown, who was a radical abolitionist, began secretly planning an armed insurrection to incite a slave rebellion in the southern United States. He gathered supporters, including his sons, and secured funding and weapons to help with this cause. In early 1859, John Brown would add additional recruits to his cause, including African-American men such as Dangerfield Newby and Osborne Anderson. John Brown would secure a small farm about 5 miles away from Harpers Ferry, Virginia, which is now in West Virginia, and he would make that his base of operations. So to keep up appearances, John Brown would send for his daughters and his daughter-in-laws to come and live in the house with them. And so these girls would wash clothes and go to the town, but their goal was also to keep the nosy neighbors away so the neighbors weren't trying to figure out what was going on at this house. September 30th, 1859, John Brown would send the women back to New York because the raid was going to happen soon and he wanted them to be safe. So the raid would take place starting on the evening of October 16th and going through October 18th. So at 8 p.m., John Brown would gather his group of 21 men, including 5 African Americans, at his rented farmhouse near Harpers Ferry. He would finalize his plans to take the federal arsenal and to start this slave rebellion. 10:30. John Brown and his men would depart from the farmhouse and begin their approximately 5-mile march to Harpers Ferry. They carried weapons and tools and extra picks for arming the enslaved people that they ran into in Harpers Ferry. By 11, Brown and his men were crossing the Potomac River using a covered bridge that led into Harpers Ferry. They would reach the outskirts of town without being detected. October 17th, midnight. Enslavers Lewis Washington and John Alstadick, might be saying his name wrong, are taken hostage and the people they enslaved are freed. This will officially be the beginning of John Brown's raid. The target was the federal arsenal, and they would quickly overpower the lone night watchman and take control of the building. This gave them access to a large stockpile of weapons. So about 1 a.m., the raiders would cut the telegraph lines leading out of Harpers Ferry to prevent the news of the attack from spreading. They would also capture other key buildings, including the U.S. Arsenal, where more weapons and ammunition were stored. So Brown's plan was to arm all the enslaved people who were going to come to Harpers Ferry and help them, but very few people actually showed up. About 2 a.m., Brown would send his men to the nearby Kennedy farm to receive additional supplies. Meanwhile, he ordered others to seize hostages. So the raiders would take captive several prominent local citizens, including Lewis Washington, which was the great-grandnephew of George Washington. About 3 a.m., a freed black man named Hayward Shepherd, who worked for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, approached the bridge that Brown's men had taken control of. He was shot and mortally wounded, becoming the first casualty of the raid. Around 4 a.m., Brown would send a small group of men to intercept an approaching train that was coming into Harpers Ferry from the east. They would stop the train, but after a brief delay, they would allow it to continue their journey. They didn't want to scare the people on the train. Well, this train would eventually reach Baltimore, and it would spread the word of the raid. By 6 a.m., the local townspeople and the local militia members were aware of what was happening and what had happened throughout the night while they had been asleep. They began to organize a resistance and surround the raiders. Several of Brown's men were pinned down in buildings, but they continued to hold their positions, hoping reinforcements would come by other enslaved people coming into Harpers Ferry to help them. About 7 a.m., sporadic gunfire is going to break out between Brown's raiders and the local militia forces. Brown would take up a defensive position inside the fire engine house, also known as the Armory's engine house, along with some of the other men and hostages. This building would later be known as John Brown's Fort. A small group of local militia from neighboring towns would arrive and take up positions around the armory. Around 11 a.m., 2 of Brown's sons, Walston Brown and Oliver Brown, are gravely wounded during the fighting. The townspeople and the militia members continue to fire on the raiders, keeping them confined inside that fire engine house. Around noon, the situation for Brown and his men would become increasingly dire as more militia members from Virginia and Maryland would join into the fight. While this is going on, news of the raid reaches Washington, D.C., prompting the United States government to act. About 2 p.m., the raiders take multiple attempts to negotiate with the militia, using the hostages as a bargaining chip. However, the militia demands the unconditional surrender of Brown and his men, and Brown refuses. Around 3 p.m., more casualties are going to occur on both sides of the firefight because it's not stopping. Several of Brown's men are going to attempt to escape, but they're going to be captured or killed by the militia. Around 6 p.m. on the 17th, so we're still on the 17th, a detachment of U.S. Marines under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee is going to be dispatched from Washington, and these Marines are going to make the journey to Harpers Ferry to end this standoff. Midnight, October 18th. So as the night progresses, Brown and his men remain trapped inside the fire engine house, surrounded by the armed militia. Morale among the raiders is really low, and several of them have been wounded or are dead. Around 6:30 a.m., the U.S. Marines, led by Lieutenant Jeb Stuart and Colonel Robert E. Lee, are going to arrive at Harpers Ferry. Stuart is going to deliver a demand for Brown to surrender, but Brown refuses, still hoping that reinforcements are coming to help him. Around 7 a.m., after receiving no response from Brown, Colonel Lee orders the Marines to storm the fire engine house. So at 7:30, the Marines are going to storm the fire engine house, capturing John Brown and the remaining raiders. During a small but intense skirmish in the building, several of Brown's men are going to be killed, including his son Watson, and Brown himself is going to be wounded, but he is going to survive. By 8 a.m., the raid officially ends. Brown has been taken prisoner along with a few of the other surviving raiders. The hostages are free and the area is secured. 16 people would be killed during the raid, including 10 of Brown's men. So October 19th, John Brown will be taken to nearby Charlestown, Virginia, where he will be charged with treason against the state of Virginia, murder, and trying to incite a slave rebellion. November 2nd, John Brown is going to have a very swift trial. He's going to be convicted on all counts. Throughout the trial, Brown tried to defend his actions, that he was being morally just, that he was drawing the nation's attention to the slave issue, but he would be convicted on all counts. It only took the jury 45 minutes to reach their decision. All 6 of Brown's men who had been captured were tried and hung. 5 men did escape. On December 2nd, John Brown would be hung in Charlestown. His execution would make him a martyr in the eyes of abolitionists, while Southern slaveholders viewed the raid as evidence of Northern aggression. So what was the impact on the nation? So John Brown's raid heightened tensions between the North and the South. And while many people in the North viewed him as a hero who stood up for oppression, many of the Southerners saw his actions as a threat to their way of life. This raid would help set the stage for the secession crisis and the Civil War. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed, it might be done right. John Brown, December 2nd, 1859. If you die, die in a good cause, fighting for liberty. If you must die, die like a man. John Brown to his son, Oliver. So John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry lasted approximately 36 to 40 hours, from the late hours of October 16th to the early morning hours of October 18th, 1859. And although the raid failed its immediate objective, it had a prolonged impact on the national conversation about slavery and would really play a part in the upcoming Civil War. So some people say John Brown's raid at Harpers Ferry was actually the first battle of the Civil War, even though we weren't in the Civil War time yet. So what do you think? Do you think John Brown's raid was the first battle of the Civil War? Do you think it was a catalyst to the Civil War? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos like this one, please like, subscribe, and comment below and tell me something that you learned today.